everybody. Today we are in the kitchen of Catherine Kovac. I am her mother, Nancy Gross, and I'm going to show you today how to make homemade chicken and noodles. First of all, we're going to list what the ingredients are for you, and this is a double batch. So in the future, if you want to do just a single batch, you would just cut these ingredients in half. I'm going to use 4 eggs, and I'm going to crack them in a large mixing bowl. I'll do that right now. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I'm going to whisk these together. You don't want to really overbeat them, but you just want to be sure they're mixed really well. And to this, I'm going to add 6 tablespoons of milk. Now, if you like, you can also use half and half, but today we're just using milk. But you want to be sure and add that milk because it's going to give your noodles a good consistency when you mix in the flour. So here's the eggs and the milk. Now I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of baking powder. And just remember that you will half these ingredients if you don't want to have a double batch. And then I need to get some salt. Just going to use this salt right here. And I'm going to put in 2 teaspoons of salt. So there goes 1 and 2. Just an interesting little sidebar to this instruction is that I got this recipe from my mother, Catherine Moore, and I feel quite sure that she probably had that handed down to her from her mother, who was Lulu Birdie Height. Okay, so now we have our dry ingredients, except for the flour, all mixed in with the egg. I think it's important to incorporate the flour and the salt with the egg before you put the flour in so that it's mixed really well. Now, I'm going to add the flour. And we're going to use 2½ cups of flour, but as I work this dough, I may need to add additional flour, and that depends on the size of the eggs you're using because that can vary. So we'll start out with our first cup. And I'm just going to whisk this in. This is kind of a critical stage right here because you really want to be sure that you're not going to get too much flour in or too little flour. You're going to have a pliable dough. So there's our first cup. And here comes our second. And at this stage, I'm going to switch over and use probably a wooden spoon or any kind of large spoon that I have available. As you can see, our dough's almost there. So,
what would you prefer? A wooden spoon?
Yep, wooden would be great.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Is this what you had in mind?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me just get that out of my whisk. When we reach the point where this dough is where we want it, you definitely don't want to be continuing on with the whisk. You want to use a spoon, a large spoon. So we'll get all of that out of there. And while I'm doing this, we have a pot of chicken broth boiling on the stove. It's very important that once you get your noodles cooked, that you have your broth boiling, and you don't dump them all in together at once. You put the noodles in, a handful at a time, and make sure that they're well separated. Okay, I'm just gonna shake this out a little bit. Now we're going to use our half measuring cup. And kind of sprinkle this in slowly. Oops, that kind of went in quickly. As you can see, it's taking the flour in still really well. You want this dough soft and pliable, but not too moist. That's the trick, is getting the dough just right. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to get my hands into it. And you might want to flour your hands a little bit before you put them into the dough so that it's not sticking too much. So I'm just going to take a little flour, get my hands floured up, and now, and just feeling this right now, I can tell I needed a little bit more flour, and that's probably due to the size of the eggs, because if your eggs are fairly large, you're going to need more flour. So it's just a thing of gauging and finding just the right amount. But as you can see, I just sprinkled a little bit in, and I'm just working it into the dough. That's starting to feel really good.
So that was
I started
cups?
out with 2.5 cups of flour,
So
but now
ended up with 3.
No, probably I just added a fourth more.
Okay.
No, because you want to add it really slowly. Because if you get to the stage where your dough is too much flour, then that's kind of a bad deal. But this is feeling really good, and I want you to see how it looks. See how pliable it's looking. I'm just working in the rest of the flour now. And I think it's feeling pretty good. Yeah, it's feeling really good. If you can see how that looks. It just, when you pull it up, you can see that it has some give to it. It's not too stiff. It's still real pliable. And what we're going to do next is lay down some parchment paper. If you have a pastry cloth, you can certainly use that too, but you want to be sure that it's well floured. And this is another key, is that you still have enough pliableness to the dough that when you roll it on the parchment paper, it's going to pick up the flour that's there and get just right.
So you do knead it also a little bit? You knead it?
I am, to make sure that all the flour is in it. I had some flour here in the bottom of the bowl, and I wanted to get it all worked in.
Okay. So we'll be right back to show you how to roll them out.
Okay, we're ready now to make noodles. We've got our dough ready to go, and it's very important now that when you get ready to roll this dough out, that you have flour down on the area where you're going to be working the noodles. So I'm putting plenty of flour on there, and I'm going to spread it around a little bit. You don't want to put a huge amount, but you want enough that it's going to coat your dough as you're working it into the surface. So also put some flour on your rolling pin so that avoids sticking. So there we go, we're all ready, we're all set. And what I'm going to do is, because this is a double batch, I'm going to start with half of it at first. That's too much dough to put on your area at one time. So I'm just going to break it in half. Get a little more flour on it from the bowl. ready to start. So see, I have a wad of dough that looks kind of like this. I'm going to put it down on my surface. And I'm going to start in the middle and just gently roll back and forth, back and forth. What I like to do once I get it looking like this is to pick it up and flip it over and sprinkle more flour on there if I need to, and then start working it again.
My Hoya plant is making a shadow.
Oh.
I'm like, what is that line in the noodle dough? It's my Hoya plant.
Oh, it's
making a shadow. So Grandma's here with us.
Grandma Moore is here with us for sure. Okay, so what I want to do, and I've learned this through trial and error, is not have the area where I'm going to cut down be too long. So I'm going to spread this out now so it's kind of like a rectangle. And as you can see, it's starting to take that rectangular shape a little bit. Always make sure that you've got enough flour going on here so that you don't stick. So it's a little thick on the top, so I'm going to get these edges rolled out. And we're almost to the point where we can start cutting. I'm going to let you take a look at how this looks, because as you can see, it's a rectangular. Oh, I see the Hoya leaf. And still a little thickness up here, so I'm going to lift this up so that you can see about how thin you want it to look. See how thin that is? Stick it on the paper a little bit. If you do have a problem sticking, I suggest using a long, thin cutting knife to just kind of get under the bottom and get that loosened up. So we will do that. But you just want it to be almost like a crepe, that thin, when you roll it out.
Okay, we'll be right back with the knife.
Okay, we are now ready to start rolling our dough in preparation for cutting the noodles. And I would like to highly recommend that when you put your dough down to roll it out, that you do use a pastry cloth and make sure that it's well floured. You can take your hands on the pastry cloth and just smooth the flour all around on the cloth. We had a bit of a sticking problem with the parchment paper, so once again I highly recommend that you try to purchase a cloth to roll this out on. So we're ready, and here's a tip: when you start rolling, make sure the bottom edge is well floured. I'm going to put some extra flour on here. And now I'm going to start rolling, and you just turn up like maybe a ½ inch to start. And I'm going to sprinkle on some extra flour here, because this is really important if you want your noodles to be nice and not lumpy, that it's well floured so that when you unroll them, they just come out perfectly before you drop them in your broth. So just roll and roll. You can work this with your fingers too towards the end if you like. And I'm just getting a lot of flour down here on the bottom. I learned that through trial and error. You really want the flour on the bottom as you start this roll, so that at the end when you cut them and you're unrolling them, that they just come out nicely. And as you can see, we've got flour all over the top of our dough. So we just keep rolling. This is rolling up really nicely right now, and it's got that nice, it's still that soft, pliable feel to it. All right, now, as you can see, we've got a big jelly roll here. And we're ready to cut.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Okay, we are now ready for the exciting part. We're going to start cutting noodles. Next to putting them in the broth and eating them, this is really a fun part. So as you can see, I'm cutting probably about 1/8 of an inch. And that's to your own particular choice. If you want thin noodles, they're going to look like this. So you just cut away. Let's see how our noodles are looking after cutting them. Pretty good. You want your noodle to look like this. See how I unrolled it out and it all came out without sticking to each other. So you can just set that aside. And you just keep cutting this one. Remember, this is a double batch that we're making, so I have a whole nother bunch of dough here in the bowl that I will roll out again.
Okay, we'll be back when it's time to plop them into the broth.
Okay, now we are ready for the last stage of our noodle project. As you can see, the noodles have been cut and they are all nicely floured. They're soft, they're pliable. We're going to put them into this pot of boiling broth. But important to remember that you don't dump the whole bowl in at once. You're going to take a little handful like this and separate it as you drop them in. And just keep repeating. Once you get some of them in there, take your spoon and start stirring. You can see that they're all separated, and that's the way you want them to stay. So we'll get all of these in here. Once they are all into this pot of boiling broth, you can reduce the heat down to medium-high. But you want it to really be boiling very well when you drop them in. A reminder, we have a double batch here, so we're going to have a lot of noodles. If you're making noodles for just 1 to 3 people and you really don't want any leftovers, then I suggest that you do the single batch. But large groups, double batch, and they're great leftovers. And we're almost in here. These turned out really nicely. They're not sticking together, which is great, and they're soft. And as we were rolling them out on the parchment paper, we made sure that they were well floured. That's very important to remember, to keep them well floured so that they don't stick. Got one sticking to the spoon here.
Okay, I think that's the
So,
last bit.
One final note, you're going to let these cook for 25 minutes. And then at the end, you can add your cut up chicken, or you can just keep it on the side if you like. Today we're going to add some cut up rotisserie chicken.
And how many chicken broths did we add to this for the double recipe?
For the double recipe, we used 3 large cartons. And I'm going to grab the carton while you take a look at the noodles. You may think that sounds like a lot of broth to start out with, but this size carton, and that's a 48-ounce carton, we ended up using 3 of these. But as they cook, there's some absorption of the broth into the noodles.
Would you like me to turn it down?
Medium high now. You want it still to be a little bubbly, but you don't want to do a hard boil. You want a hard boil when you put them in, so it kind of sets them. But then in the 25 minutes that you'll be cooking them, medium high is a good way to go.
Awesome. We will be back with the finished product.
Okay, we are now almost ready to eat these fabulous noodles. They are just having some rotisserie chicken that's been chopped added into them. If you prefer, you can keep the chicken out on the side. We kind of like to put it in with the noodles, but whatever your preference. So these noodles have been cooking for 25 minutes. We started them out in a pot of boiling broth and then lowered it to medium low or to simmer for the 25 minutes. And I'm going to give it a stir. Speaking of stirring, want to be sure that you stir the pot regularly. You don't have to constantly stir it, but here's our finished product. And what more can I say? Just enjoy.
Thanks, Mom.
You're welcome.
It looks amazing.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye now.